Augustine chapter 19. But what was it really that had taken Miss G up through Beverly Hills that morning to shout hello and knock on the gate of the Garrick's house? Despite what she said, she had not been looking for a job. She had one of those already, a modest job working the till at a cafeteria near Matilda's Corner at the front of Beverly Hills. And neither had she been looking for anyone to help her with her O-level subjects. That was something that came to her on the spot. And although she welcomed the help, she was more than capable of doing it all on her own. The truth is, for Miss G, every step up that hill had been a step not towards a future, but towards a past. And when Mrs. Garrick had opened the door and said, "Good morning," what Miss G had experienced was a small panic of the heart, a widening of the eyes, and O of the mouth. "So I am here again," she thought, "back in Beverly Hills, back at the Garrick's house." But she could not explain this to Mrs. G. Though she had walked up the hill with such determination, when she saw Mrs. G, her mouth had gone completely dry. She could not find the words to say why she was there that morning, and how it was that she had been there before. She did not know how to provide Mrs. Garrick with a context. Instead, it was Mrs. G who offered one to her. "Are you looking for work?" Mrs. Garrick had asked, and Miss G had almost laughed. This poor white woman, she thought. She can think of no other context in which a young woman such as me should end up at a house such as this. But it was easier, wasn't it? It was so much easier and less awkward than the truth. It gave Miss G a quicker way to get inside the house, and so she accepted this false context. She said to herself that as soon as she was inside, she would tell Mrs. G everything. The long speech she had practiced, but it didn't happen that morning. She began working at the house the following Monday, and said to herself, one day very soon, I will sit Mrs. G down and give her a cup of mint tea to calm her nerves, and then I will explain everything. I going to say to Mrs. G, "Ma'am, I am an honest woman, and I am not here to hustle for no money. That is not what this is about. But we are connected in another way, ma'am. There is another context in which we ought to know and speak to each other." But days became weeks, and weeks became months, and just like that, the months became 3 years. Instead of explaining herself or her past, Miss G threw herself into her new work, both the housework and the schoolwork, cooking and cleaning and washing during the day, then reading and studying and revising in the afternoons. Every evening, that house in Beverly Hills transformed itself into a virtual classroom. Mrs. G threw herself completely into it as well. She raided her son's bedroom for whatever O-level syllabuses and textbooks he had left behind. She went to Sangster's bookstore to buy the shortfall. She also bought exercise books, pens, pencils, a ream of graph paper, a calculator, and a geometry set. She went to bed late at night, teaching herself things before trying to teach them to Miss G. At first, her aim was simple. She was going to help Miss G get through 1 or 2 subjects. But of course, she did not know anything about Miss G's past, and had greatly underestimated her helper's abilities. Things dawned on the employer slowly. More than once, it had seemed to her that Miss G wasn't learning anything for the first time. Instead, she was remembering things she had once known. Miss G picked up on things too quickly, almost effortlessly, like someone relearning the use of a muscle. After only 5 months, the helper took 3 subjects, mathematics, English language, and English literature. She got grade A in all of them. Mrs. G saw the paper bearing these results, and her mouth opened and closed several times, soundlessly, like a fish. Mrs. G rolled up her sleeves and decided to make things harder the next round. All right, I see that you can handle this, Miss G. So let us do 5 more subjects. And together they embarked on advanced mathematics, geography, history, chemistry, and biology. Mrs. G herself never quite got the hang of the advanced mathematics or the chemistry, but it did not matter. Miss G did, and once again she sat the 5 exams and got grade A for everything. Mrs. G was astonished. This was the brightest pupil she had ever taught. It seemed to her that Miss G was the kind of person for whom the cliché was true. She had a fertile mind, which is to say that once a bit of knowledge was planted in her brain, it grew on its own and produced more knowledge. Eventually, it became its own thick forest, but one that Miss G could always navigate her way through. She ruminated on things and they became more complex in her mind. They produced a pleasing density. She did not separate one subject from another, allowing her knowledge of mathematics to graft itself onto her knowledge of biology, or her knowledge of history to cross-pollinate her knowledge of chemistry, and so on. She was a natural academic. She saw connections in things where most people would not. But now, Miss G was taking down book after book from Mrs. G's shelves, going through them rapidly. Some evenings, Mrs. G would come home from Augustown Primary to find all the housework done and Miss G in her son's bedroom, there on the bed, reading 3 books at once. Caught in this manner, Miss G would jump off the bed. "Sorry, Mrs. G, I never mean anything by it. I was just resting my foot and reading." No, there's nothing to apologize for," Mrs. G would say dismissively, but she always felt a little queer. "Okay, we will do A-levels now," the principal said one day, desperate to find something, anything that would challenge Miss G. Timothy Garrick, who came in late each evening, often found the 2 women at the dining table still working. He tried, in his own way, to intervene, to talk some sense into his wife. One night in the dark, as they were patting their pillows and taking their usual shapes in the bed, he said to her, "Claudia, what is really going on with you and that helper, though? Don't you think you are taking this too far now? She's not your daughter, for God's sake." Mr. Garrick regretted saying this as soon as it was out of his mouth. He knew his wife would think, as he was now thinking, about the child they had lost 15 years ago, the daughter they never had, the little sister they could not give to their son. The wound of it was suddenly raw. Mrs. G jumped out of the bed with an agility that frightened her husband. She stormed over to the light switch and violently flicked it on. The brightness from the ceiling bulbs and the anger in Mrs. G's eyes glared down on what had become a trembling man. "Now you look here, Timothy," Mrs. G said to him. "I do not interfere with your work, and you will not interfere with mine. That girl is doing just fine, and I want to tell you something else. When she gets into university, which, mark my words, she will, we are going to help her with her school fees, and I don't want to hear a peep from you about it. She has the brains, and we have the finances, and that is that. You understand me?" All right, Mr. Garrick said plaintively. "I was just making a simple—" But Timothy Garrick looked at his wife again and thought better of it. "Yes, Claudia, I'm sorry. I never mean anything by it." Mrs. G made a sound in her throat and then turned off the lights a second time. She climbed back into bed, but there remained, for that night, a frostiness between the two. Mrs. G remembers that night now as she sits with Miss G on a bench in the garden. They are under the shade of a sweet almond tree. Neither of them is looking at the other. Rather, their gaze travels down the hill towards Mona and further across towards Augustown. If they are avoiding each other's eyes, they are avoiding even more than that. They are avoiding the unopened envelope which Miss G holds in her hand. Though it was delivered to the Garrick's post office box, it is addressed to her, Miss Gina Elizabeth MacDonald. In the top right corner is a blue pelican, the crest of the University of the West Indies. Mrs. G knows that there is something unbridgeable between herself and the helper, something to do with class and color. Over the past year, there have been times when she has turned around to find Miss G looking at her with something in her eyes which, if she had to name it, she would call disapproval, though it wasn't quite that. In any case, on such occasions, Miss G would look away quickly or busy herself suddenly as if knowing she had been found out, and a queer feeling would come over the principal. Mrs. G understands that of the two of them, it is Miss G who has the better mind, and so she feels strangely judged by the young woman's silent looks. To no one's surprise, Miss G has received all A's in her A-levels, and so it is almost certain that she has got into the Faculty of Law. The envelope she now holds in her hand is pleasingly fat. Rejection, Mrs. G knows, comes in thin envelopes, if it comes at all. Single sheets of paper with white space like snow around a cold and callous message. We regret to inform you that your application was not successful. Barely ever more than that. But good news comes in envelopes such as this, thick envelopes. The news explained over multiple sheets of paper. So Mrs. G isn't sure why Miss G is just sitting here, refusing to break the seal. In fact, Mrs. G has never seen her helper so emotional or so vulnerable. Miss G looks down on the letter again, and her eyes well up. Mrs. G tries again. Why don't you just open it, Miss G? Get it over with. Miss G wipes her face on her blouse, and then looks down the hill towards Augusttown. Ma'am, she begins slowly, I can't thank you enough for all the help you give me so far. I never expect people like you to help people like me. Miss G is now looking Mrs. G straight in the eye. You are a good woman, Mrs. G. Better than I did expect. Claudia Garrick smiles, feeling at once moved, but also that there is a history behind this remark that she might never know. I'm sorry, ma'am, Miss G continues, but I can't open the letter here. I do all these things, get my subjects, apply to university, without the two most important people in my life knowing. My Taffy who raised me, and my little boy Kaya. So I think I owe them this part of it. I need to open the letter in front of them. Mrs. G turns away quickly, hoping Miss G will not see the sudden flash of hurt in her eyes. It is the hurt of a mother. The two women sit in silence, the unopened letter creating a large space between them. A breeze blows and ruffles the leaves of the almond tree, and on that breeze comes the snippet of a song, Fly Away Home to Zion. The song dies with the wind. What was that? Mrs. G asks, her heart beating fast. It is the most beautiful voice she has ever heard. Miss G raises her shoulders in a shrug, but she too has felt strangely moved. A rash of goose pimples covers her arms, and the hairs stand up on the back of her neck. Another gust blows, and with it comes a second snatch of song. Fly away home to Zion, fly away home. The two women stand up now. They strain their eyes down the hill, trying without binoculars to see Augusttown. It is the dreadful day of the autoclaps, and these are the four things Mrs. G will always remember about it. 1. The little boy whose eyes had been swollen and red from crying. She had passed him at the gate of the school. She was leaving work early, excited to deliver the letter she had picked up to Miss G. It was only later that she would realize she should have stopped to speak to the boy. She didn't know then that he was connected to everything. 2. The small bit of song that rode on the wind all the way from Augusttown, past Mona, and up to the sweet almond tree under which she and Miss G had been sitting. 3. The unopened letter that sat between her and Miss G. 4. And Miss G herself, Gina Elizabeth MacDonald, 8th of January 1961 to the 11th of April 1982. There will be no burial and there will be no tombstone, but this much is certain. Hers will be the second death on the day of the auto collapse. Chapter 20. When Kaya left the classroom, the thing that hit him hardest was the coolness of the day pressing down directly on his head. To everyone else, the day was terribly humid, but without his dreadlocks, it had felt like a kind of December day, like a Christmas breeze was blowing on his head. His head felt strange to him, and with it his whole body. He could no longer find his balance, and so he wobbled out of the classroom rather than walked. Out there in the corridor he began to cry, but in all, he cried for less than 10 minutes. What should have been a torrential cloudburst, what should have been the kind of drowning rain that washes the loose marl off the roads and then deposits it as a ruining layer of white in all the nearby yards, the kind of rain that gets beneath the mango trees and then leans them into the zinc houses, passed too quickly. Whenever he cried, his grandmother would always tell him, "You need a backbone, boy." She thought this was the way to raise a man-child, without quite understanding that sometimes it takes backbone to cry the long length of tears required. One day, Ma Taffy will stop to consider this, that maybe if Kaya had kept wailing, maybe if he had kept within him that indignation and that fighting spirit, maybe if he had found a deeper well of tears to draw from, it would have taken him all the way into the principal's office, Mrs. G, who would have listened to him and who would have marched to classroom 2B and told Mr. St. Joseph's in no uncertain terms that he should never return to the school. Mrs. G, who would have known then that the right thing to do was to put Kaya into the front seat of her car and drive him to his home. The principal, who would have drawn the eyes of all Augustown to her for driving her big car into the tiny zinc fence lane. She would have parked the car right there, got out, and walked up to the veranda where she, Ma Taffy, would be sitting, and Mrs. G would have explained clearly and briefly to the old woman what had happened that day. Mrs. G, who would have known instinctively to do this without any groveling or any wringing round of her hands, because her presence alone would have signaled the desperation of her apology. And though Ma Taffy knew this, she would have raised her voice at the principal, would have called on brimstone and thunder and judgment, but it would only have been because she too was playing the role expected of her, because the ears of Augustown would have been listening and would have needed to hear her make the most of this one opportunity when one of their own could give a piece of their mind to a big somebody in society. But Ma Taffy would have understood the principal's integrity. The old woman would have heard it from the very beginning, from the stuttered sound of her car engine approaching the house, and Ma Taffy would have respected this big woman of society for having willingly made herself small in the presence of a small woman like herself. Ma Taffy would have accepted the apology and would have known how to explain things to Gina, and they would have accepted that although a great wrong had been done to their family, this was one of the few times that Babylon had acknowledged such wrongdoing and had offered them an IOU, something for future payment. But none of it happened like that. When Kaya stepped out of classroom 2B, he had flung his head back in the doorway, and the first wailing sound came out of him. It was a long wah, a sound like a siren. He then took a sharp, hiccupy breath and let out another sound much like the first. His tears made the world blurry. He dragged his skinny feet down the corridor, past other classrooms. Boys in their khaki uniforms and girls in their blue plaid cotton dresses turned to observe him for a second, but just as quickly they turned back to their lessons. A teacher had stepped out from her classroom into Kaya's path. The little boy stopped. The teacher seemed like a peach-clad giant in front of him. Her matronly linen suit was starch-stiff, and her stout arms were akimbo. Kaya hiccuped and wailed again. He held his arms out, thinking that she might lift him up. The woman sucked her teeth. "Little boy, you just hush up the damn cow bawling and go where you're going." She made a funny face as if she was about to spit. Disgraceful. She looked the boy up and down and then flounced back into her classroom. Kaya had continued in the general direction of Mrs. G's office, but already his crying had diminished in volume and conviction. He had begun to doubt himself. He wondered suddenly if Mr. St. Joseph's might even have been right to do what he had done. Adults were always right. They had their reasons. Maybe what had happened really was because he was just too rude. He wasn't sure. He had never felt particularly rude, even on those nights when he found it hard to fall asleep, no matter how tightly he closed his eyes, or those mornings when he refused to eat all the callaloo on his plate and his mother or Ma Taffy would tell him off. And even then, they would be holding his hand softly or stroking his head, something to make him know he wasn't really being rude at all. But what if the principal also told him to stop the damn cow bawling? Just stop it. What if she too made a funny face and told him he was disgraceful? He turned and walked towards the school gate. He had stopped crying completely. As he approached the gate, the security guard opened it wide. Kaya thought this was for him, as he hadn't heard the vehicle behind him. It was Mrs. G. She began to drive out of the gate, but turned and looked Kaya in the eye. She stopped the car and rolled down her window. "Are you all right, son?" He looked at her but could not find any words. Mrs. G frowned. After a moment, she wound the window back up and drove away. Kaya walked through the open gate of the school and back onto the dry roads of Augustown. He continued hiccuping, but the whining siren had ceased. Already he was falling into the silence he would never escape from, which is not to say that he became mute. Rather, he was folding himself into himself. He was learning how to become withdrawn and surely. He was learning how to be defeated. And once learned, it was a lesson Kaya would find impossible to unlearn. He reached around to touch his dreadlocks, but his hands only found empty air. Tears flooded his eyes again, and he cried silently. His mother had always told him that his strength was in his dreadlocks. She had told him that his dreadlocks were his lion's mane. Whenever something bad happened to him, Ma Taffy would sit in a corner muttering something about a backbone. But his mother would hold him close and then cup his chin with her hand and lift up his face so that he was looking at her. "You see this right here?" she would say, reaching around to touch his locks. "You is a lion, just like Ma Taffy, just like me. We is lions, Kaya, conquering lions. I'm not saying you mustn't be upset, and I'm not saying you mustn't cry either. But whenever something bad happen, you just touch your natty locks and remind yourself that you is a lion. We're stronger than all the bullshit that happen around us. You understand me?" But what could Kaya hold on to now? Maybe he was no longer a lion like his mummy or his grandma. Less than 10 minutes. It was not enough tears for what had happened to him. Still, Ma Taffy, over a mile away, had heard him, and also she had smelt the strange, choking sweetness of the day. End of chapter 20.